A brief overview of creative evolution by Henri Bergson, published 1906. The principal ideas are that the attempt to understand the self by analyzing it in terms of static concepts must fail to reveal the dynamic changing character of the self. There is an interesting force that shows itself in living things, an elan vital, that has endured through the ages, accounting for the creative evolution of life and of instinct and intelligence in living things. Instinct is limited in that although it grasps the fluid nature of living things, it is limited to the individual, but intellect is limited in that although it constructs general truths, it imposes upon life the static character of concepts. But by the capacity of intuition, a disinterested and self-conscious instinct, a kind of knowledge is made possible which is superior to that provided by either instinct or intellect working separately. At the time of his death in 1941, in the France dominated by the Nazis, Bergson was a relatively forgotten man, forgotten by the cultivated public, given little attention by the professional philosopher. Yet in the first 2 decades of this century he was lionized by the former and respected and often received enthusiastically by the latter. His fame was made by the immensely popular Creative Evolution. In this book he engages in metaphysical speculation on the grand scale, projecting his views back into the remote past and forward into the future. He speculates about matters that are difficult to speak about and impossible to verify in any of the traditionally accepted ways. Indeed, he mounts a concerted attack on traditional philosophical assumptions and techniques, insisting in particular that the dominant mechanistic and materialistic approach can lead only to a gross misrepresentation of reality. The chief villain here is intellect itself, for it can operate only through the use of concepts, and concepts are fixed, static categories that cannot contain fluid reality. Obviously he hadn't read Hegel, or if he had done, he didn't really understand it anyway. There was a strong strain of anti-intellectualism in Bergson. These basic views are expressed first in his discussion of the self. Perhaps the most noteworthy feature of our inner life is the unceasing change that occurs there, the unceasing flow of thoughts, feelings, perceptions, and volitions. It is quite natural to think of this change as a succession of states in which each state holds the stage for a while before it is followed by its successor. Pursuing this analysis, we are led to think of the states themselves as internally static and changeless, for change is just the replacement of one state by another. Similarly, we are led to think of time as a succession of moments within which temporal change does not occur. Having cut the self into a collection of independent and static atoms of experience, we then wonder how this collection can constitute a unified, dynamic self. But we solve this difficulty by postulating the existence of an unexperienced mental subject that supports them, holds them together, and accounts for the manner of their succession. We have gone astray, Bergson says, because we have tried to describe the dynamic, pulsating self by using concepts that inevitably impose their foreign rigidity upon it. Change in the self is not a process in which unchanging blocks are successfully cast into and out of existence. Rather, it is a continuous process occurring in a self in which states, if we must use that term, are not units demarcated by sharp lines, but are at most centers of intensity trailing off indefinitely within the unbroken fabric of experience. Because it is growing, the self is changing in a direction that cannot be reversed, the past accumulating around the present as snow accumulates around a rolling snowball. To be such a changing thing is to be a self, and to experience such irreversible change is to have a history. This dynamic snowballing time, this time that counts, is real time or duration, as Bergson calls it, to distinguish it from the conceptualized, static, essentially reversible time of the mathematician. Memory is not the recalling of experiences that have long departed, but is the past living on in the present, affecting our present behavior. Consequently, in the self, there is no exact repetition of past patterns, and novelty is the rule. Man is free, for in using the past he creates the future. We can discover all this for ourselves if we attend to our own inner life and are not misled by the concepts intellect would like to impose. Duration is not to be thought about, it is to be experienced, for only experience can reveal it to us. Compared with the self, physical objects do not grow and change, they do not have memories, they do nothing new, they do not have histories, they do not endure, for time makes no difference to them. The planets revolve as they always have, they will continue to do so, except insofar as they are subject to changing external forces. The static concepts of mathematics and physics apply quite appropriately to them because they lend themselves to description in just such terms. These differences between physical objects and the living self indicate the presence of something in the latter that is not in the former. Some dynamic element that makes a difference between the accumulative purposeful, creative behavior of the one and the passive, repetitious, monotonous existence of the other. If we turn to biological phenomena, and especially to the evolution of living things, we will discover overwhelming evidence in support of this thesis. One of the main examples is that of the evolution of the eye. Both the complex arrangement of otherwise useless components and the long history of increasingly complex sensory organs cannot be explained plausibly unless we assume some sort of integrating force that is moving in a definite direction. Bergson cites the biological evidence that supports the fact of evolution, but we are not concerned with the fact itself as much as we are with what it presupposes. Darwin's theory of the survival of the fittest is all right as far as it goes, but it does not explain why mutation should occur in the first place, or why many of them survive when they have no immediate survival value. Bergson rejects three theories before he offers his own. First, he says that no mechanistic or materialistic account will do, for such an account forces the dynamic processes of life into the straitjacket of physical concepts, and is insisting that the future is determined completely by the past, repudiates the duration, freedom and creation evident in the realm of living things. Second, Bergson rejects any finalistic view that describes the world as being attracted or directed towards some future goal, some end it cannot avoid, for such a view replaces one form of determinism by another. Finally, he repudiates the vitalism that was current in the biology of his day, for the postulation of a vital principle whose function is restricted to explaining the organization of parts and drives within the individual does not explain the fact of evolution. Bergson's own view is a sort of cosmic vitalism, in which the vital principle, or elan vital, as he calls it, is life itself as it has endured through the ages, and evolution is the history of the effort of life to free itself from the domination of matter and to achieve self-consciousness, beginning as the dimmest spark distinguishing the living from the dead, thrusting itself out in various directions. The elan vital has tried one by one the experiments represented by the divergent branches of the evolutionary tree, many of the resultant forms have long ago been rejected as unsuitable, and others have been allowed to stagnate, as the elan has continuously diverted its energies into the more promising ones. It pushed out into the vegetable and animal kingdoms and found that the latter allowed it greater scope. It discovered that the storage and explosive release of energy led to freedom, that motion and consciousness are better than a sedentary torpor, that defense through high mobility and dexterity is better than that of armor, and so on, through a host of minor and major alternatives. The most significant dichotomy of all has been that between the arthropods, which have developed through the various insect forms to culminate in the Hymenoptera, and the vertebrates, which have diversified but culminated in man. This dichotomy is significant because the culminating species embody the best solutions the elan has yet found in its long struggle to emancipate itself from the matter that drags it down, the solutions represented by instinct and intelligence. Both instinct and intelligence emerged as instruments for manipulating matter. Intellect fulfills this function through its ability to apprehend problems and to produce the mechanical devices needed to solve them. In fact, according to Bergson, intelligence is the faculty of making objects, such as tools to make tools, and of varying the manufacture at will. Arising from the animal's hesitation in a dilemma, intelligence expresses itself in thought rather than in action, developing the technique of language. It can operate when the original stimulus is no longer present. Becoming aware of this subjective process, it develops self-consciousness, concentrating on relation and forms. It frees itself from matter and develops the ability to generalize, and finally, using these resources and indulging its aroused curiosity, it turns from practical to theoretical matters. Instinct, too, operates through the use of tools, but the tools in this case are integral parts of the body, tools designed for a specific use and limited to that use. The instinctive reactions of the insect are short and precise, but their scope is both limited and invariant. Instincts are released directly in action and function unconsciously, yet they do involve an important kind of not knowledge about, but an unconscious empathy with the object, with their object. Both intellect and instinct have their advantages as well as their disadvantages. Among the great advantages of intellect are its consciousness and its ability to discover general truths, but it has disadvantages stemming from its inability to grasp things except through forms that are suggested to it by the object, but crystallized into sharply defined concepts by itself. Thus, it is limited in two respects. It can grasp only the external form of a thing, and it cannot have an static concept through which instinct has the advantage of grasping the fluid nature of living things, but it is to the individual and does not attain consciousness. The production of instinct and intelligence is an experiment in which the elan has been articulating divergent but complementary tendencies that have lain dormant in it from the beginning. Through the resultant clarification, it is readying itself to combine the desirable features of each in a new capacity that will transcend both. This new capacity already appears fleetingly in man. It is the capacity of intuition, a capacity that may be described briefly as instinct, that has become disinterested and self-conscious. Artists to a greater extent, and most men to a lesser, are able to place themselves in a sort of divining sympathy with things and with other people. It manifests itself in situations in which men are not dominated by disinterested thought, in the crises of life where problems press in and drastic action is required, and in moments of intense joy, sadness, or commiseration. In such cases, and for a brief time, we know our own being and that of others in a much more intimate fashion than we do when we sit in our studies and describe ourselves. Life then becomes aware of itself, of duration, and of the world. Not through the distorting mediation of concepts, but directly and immediately. Man in his present state cannot maintain such insight for long, but if the elan is successful, it will develop beings who can. What the nature of that intuition will be, whether the elan will attain its goal of complete self-consciousness and complete dominance over matter, we cannot tell. We cannot tell, for we are manifestations of the elan, and it does not know. It is striving less blindly than it did in the past ages, but still it does not know. In the first half of his book, when he pits the elan against matter, It appears as if Bergson were maintaining that the world is composed of two radically different and independent principles. But in the latter half he makes it clear that he does not maintain such a metaphysical dualism. The distinction he has made between the elan and matter shares the defect of all distinctions made by the intellect. It is overdrawn. On the one hand, the physical world around us is not quite as static and inert as it appears in the enclosed systems of the physicist. For if we regard it over long periods and great expanses, we will find that it does not repeat itself quite as monotonously as we sometimes think it does. On the other hand, the self is not a continually creative, pure burn center of energy, for it can lapse into periods of lethargy during which it approaches the status of a physical thing. This is not to deny that there is a big difference between elan and matter, but it is to deny that the difference is an absolute one. It has the signs of being a difference in degree rather than one of kind. If we retrace our steps in time, we will find that the difference was even less long ago. Did the first organic things differ radically from the inorganic compounds from which they arose? Did not their emergence presuppose some prior creative activity? Its life and matter stem from a common inarticulated source that contained neither as we know them, even though it did contain the tendencies from which they have evolved. Feeling dimly a need for creation, the primal substance began to stir, and gathering strength erratically, but gradually, it generated life and matter by processes that are the inverse of each other. Sometimes Bergson writes as if the quickening in the original indeterminate source has led to its articulation into parts that vary in their vitality, the less vital lapsing into relatively passive matter that resists the efforts of the more vital to move it or to move through it. At other times he writes as if the resistance to life stems from life itself. It is pictured as a frail element that overextends itself, that depletes itself, and that lapses into lethargy before it can gather itself together for another spurt, if I may so put it. Matter is tired life. If the elan is a flowing current, then matter is a congealing of it. If the elan is a cosmic tension, then extension is the interruption or disappearance of that tension. Bergson expresses himself in two particularly vivid metaphors. The first is that of the vessel of steam from which live jets escape, travel through space, lose their energy, condense into water, and fall only to provide a cooling medium that saps the energy of the jets that, in penetrating it, try to carry it with them in their upward thrust. Thus, through the ages, both life and matter have come from an inexhaustible reservoir, generated by processes that are the inverse of each other and having inverse effects upon each other. The other, and perhaps better metaphor, is that in which the emerging elan is likened to a series of skyrockets. Imagine an original skyrocket that rises, slows down, and bursts, scattering into its exhausted fragments through the sky. Imagine also that as it bursts, it releases a number of rockets that gather speed and mount upwards in various directions through the debris. Some of these, retarded by their own weight and slowed by the resisting ashes of their predecessors, will simply fizzle out, doomed to do no more than scatter debris yet higher in the sky. But in the final burst, some will release still others that will probe the upper reaches before they too die, barrenly or fruitfully. In this fashion, the original urge to life has climbed through the ages, fighting its own lethargy, thrusting through or by the static remnants of its past endeavors, gathering strength to go off in new directions, sometimes succeeding and sometimes failing in its attempt to attain higher levels of consciousness. Bergson's reliance on vivid metaphors of this sort accounts in part for the immediate impact the book had, but it also gives rise to some of the more severe criticism levelled at him. Metaphors are suggestive, but they are not accurate. Time and the self may both be like a rolling snowball rather than like a series of beads on a string. Matter may be like congealing jelly, or life like a river seeking the easiest path through the constraining land, and the elan may be like a stream or skyrockets, but such suggestions should be followed by hard-headed, non-metaphorical analyses. Although Bergson was often a good critic of other speculations, the exposition of his own doctrine remains both ambiguous and vague. The concepts of duration, matter, elan vital, and intuition are never entirely clarified, and different images of them are not really reconciled. Furthermore, the distinction between epistemological and metaphysical considerations is not maintained, particularly in the discussion of matter, where it is often unclear whether the villain is our concept of matter or matter itself. His criticism of the mathematician's account of space and time is based on an inadequate knowledge of the mathematics of the continuum, for apparently he believed all series must be discrete series. Finally, his attacks on the extent and accuracy of intellectual knowledge, and in particular his assumptions that the intellect must distort and that it is the blind captive of its own distortion, seems too extreme. Perhaps Bergson would reply that although the intellect is capable of giving us knowledge of a sort, better knowledge may be achieved by intuition. Perhaps he would defend his use of metaphors in this way, also arguing that in using them he deliberately intends to lead us away from conceptual analysis, which must fail, towards intuition, which alone can succeed. Intuition, duration, the self, or the elan, cannot accurately be described simply because they are indescribable. He can only point to the sort of experience in which they are immediately known, and urge us to discover them for ourselves.